Hello and welcome to Authors. I'm your host, Danielle Ross Winslow. On today's episode, we have Dr. Melanie Peffer, author of Biology Everywhere, How the Science of Life Matters to Everyday Life. This is the first episode of Authors that isn't being filmed in the Fort Collins Public Media Studio, and Melanie has joined us on Zoom. Hello, Melanie, and welcome to Authors.
Thank you for having me.
Great. Well, I wanted to start off today just having you tell us a bit about your inspiration for writing Biology Everywhere.
So there were a couple of important experiences that led to me writing Biology Everywhere. And one of the most important ones was one of my earliest teaching experiences at the college level was teaching non-science majors biology. And at the beginning of every semester, I would ask these students to tell me a little bit about themselves. And they would tell me at the beginning of every semester that they were terrified to take my class, that they were not good at science. They were just there to take, to get their science requirement out of the way. And I remember one student, this always really stuck with me. She wrote on her little introduction to me, she said, "I have learned, underlined, to hate science." And it was just such a moment of, oh my goodness, why do all these students come in and all have these attitudes of, I'm not good at this, I can't do biology, I can't do science. And it wasn't just my students either. That's a similar conversation I've had with friends and family over the years. And there's this kind of pervasive attitude where people don't feel confident to do biology. So in the context of my own class, I started thinking, where do these attitudes come from? And what do we do? How can we help students gain confidence in biology? And so I really changed my teaching approach to be about applications and how biology related to students' majors. Because again, these were non-science majors. These are business majors and education majors and psychology majors and music majors. And so I changed my teaching approach to be more about applications to our daily lives and applications to their major. And the students just loved it. And so they started coming back to me at the end of the semester and saying, this was my first positive experience I've ever had in a science class. I had students that were declaring biology majors and minors after taking my class. And it was like, okay, this is exciting. I want to extend this way of teaching to the world. And so that was the inspiration for writing Biology Everywhere. It's biology as we experience it in our daily lives and in ways we usually don't think about. So there's a whole chapter on biology and the arts, and there's another chapter on biology and business, and there's two different chapters on biology and psychology as well.
Great. And I think I heard your dedicatee in the background there a little bit as we do the first author series ever completely remote and on Zoom. So, All right, you talk about rampant scientific illiteracy in the book, but you also point out that because science says so is a really common argument that people make when someone's defending a position or a belief. So why are we at once so quick to point to science as the answer and all-knowing, and at the same time so intimidated to engage with scientific concepts and ideas?
That is a great question. So how I usually think about this is that when we think about how people learn and understand and think about science, so their epistemological beliefs about science, one part of that is the source of science knowledge. And so if we believe that scientists are really smart because they understand science, then it becomes that, well, if science says it, it has to be true. So it kind of fits in with what I was saying before about people don't feel confident to engage in it. But somebody who can engage in it, well, they must just be super smart, so we should listen to everything that they say. And so I think that's where it comes from, where people are like, well, science says so, or the scientist said this, because I think it fundamentally comes down to people just not being confident. So instead of being like, oh, I understand this principle, I understand how this works, so... and some of it too is a recognition of that scientists have a lot of training and understanding too, but I still feel like there's a little bit of the lack of confidence there too.
For sure. One of the goals of your book then is to give people that confidence, right? To empower them to engage with the issues and make informed decisions. And you examine different issues in the book. You look at genetic modification as one example. Now there's a lot of information out there. So how does one even start to make an informed decision about something as complex as genetic modification in this modern information age?
Yes, absolutely. And that kind of brings up a couple of different can of worms too about empowering people to engage with biology, and also some training in, okay, what is good evidence and what is not good evidence too. Especially when we think about things like genetic modification, there's good evidence on both sides, and then there's also a lot of very poor evidence as well. So with genetic modification in the book, I tried to present both sides of the argument, because there are valid points for and against genetic modification, particularly of our foods. But at the same time, there's also good evidence and bad evidence. So something I get into in the book is, how do we consider source and bias, and what is the peer review process, and how does the peer review process work? How does grant funding work? Because that all fits into how we evaluate the source of information.
Yeah, one thing I really appreciated in your book was this description of creativity in biology as, being able to rethink the obvious and connect dots in new ways. And this really struck me as universal across any discipline. But I know, like, at least in my own academic career in social science, I didn't learn about creativity or how to engage in the creative process. And maybe that's changed or is changing. It's been some years since I've been in that environment. But are learning institutions teaching scientists about creativity? And if not, should they be?
I don't think creativity is typically taught at the college level. I think they're starting to think about how we teach the arts as part of the STEAM movement in K-12. But the real creative nature of science, I don't think we usually see. And I think part of that is because in K through 16 classrooms, a lot of what students see is what's called simple inquiry. You put this on that and something changes color. We have science, right? And so there isn't room for creativity. There isn't room to really explore authentic science inquiry, which is in fact a very creative process. You get results that you have no idea what to do with, and you've got to come up with a creative way to do it. We see a lot of creativity right now with the COVID-19 epidemic, because people are needing to think outside the box of, okay, where are we going to get face masks for people? What kind of creative solutions are we going to do? What kind of treatments are we going to come up with? That's not something that people look up in a book. They have to be able to think creatively about these issues to come up with solutions.
Well, I also really enjoyed reading about the biology of music and learning about what goes on in our bodies and brains when we hear or play music. Something that I and like so many others love to do. And it's great to know that it's also good for you.
Yes.
Yeah, has so many biological benefits. But the relationship between music and biology isn't an obvious one necessarily, but maybe more so to you, where music and biology have been so important in your life. I'm going to talk about the roles biology and music have played for you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been playing the flute for, I think, over 20 years now, which makes me feel a little bit old. So music has always been a really central part of my life. And, my dad took me to the lab when I was a kid. So I remember drawing on the whiteboard, and that's when whiteboards were, new and really cool too. Drawing on the whiteboard when I was little. And so science and music have been a part of my life, since the very, very beginning. And as I kind of went through school, and so, I'm doing band and orchestra and also taking AP science classes, there were two things that I was always passionate about. And yet I would get, and there still are a lot of messages about it's one or the other. It's the arts or the sciences. And so when I started college, I had to pick. I had to choose whether or not I was going to be a music major or a biology major. And it was a hard choice for me. And I ended up going with biology because I knew I could always continue to make music, and I have. So I've been, I was in the college marching band and orchestra the whole way through college. And then I was been in various community band groups since then, community marching bands as well, while also still doing biology. And an observation I made over and over and over again was how many of my fellow musicians were also science people. And so starting to ask these questions about why do people who gravitate towards STEM careers are also sitting in these music groups on the weekends too. And it was just kind of an interesting observation. And so they've been an important part of my life, and I've seen them be an important part of others' lives too. And I wonder if it comes back to your question about creativity as well, that you have to be creative to be a good scientist. And creativity, we express that in the arts too, and in music.
So you're in good company with a lot of scientists there, right? Including Albert
Yes.
Einstein. So you talked too about consumer decisions around going green. And, we make a lot of assumptions about which products are green and which are not based on, materials they're made from, or if they're reusable or recyclable. And we tend to see this kind of black and white, green, not green. But you point out there's a lot of shades of gray and trade-offs, both for people and the planet, that many don't consider. Can you give us an example or two of what those trade-offs are that you share in your book?
Sure. So one example that I talk about is reusable bags. And so I go to reusable bags because it's been in the news quite a bit, at least in Colorado and elsewhere as well, especially because Kroger, which is a major supermarket chain in the US, they own King Soopers, have been talking about phasing out all of their plastic bags. So then this leads to the question, well, is that actually a green decision? So if we look at the arguments against plastic bags, they don't get recycled. They leach microplastics in the environment. They're also suffocation hazards. So then it's like, okay, well, reusable bags are the way to go. But the problem is that it takes so much energy to make reusable bags. And so if you're just looking at the amount of carbon emissions that occur during production, plastic bags are a lot greener. But then they go and sit in landfills forever. So reusable bags are better if you're thinking of it from a disposal standpoint, and you bring it with you. And so if you look at some of the data on it, you have to use a reusable bag about 37 times before it becomes greener. So if you're like a lot of people that I know and you forget your reusable bags every time you go to the store and you start amassing a collection of them, they're not that green anymore. But then you're still not sending stuff to the landfill. So there's a tension there that it's just like, oh, well, I have my reusable bag. It has to be better. But it's only better if you're actually using it. And then we think of things like cotton totes. Cotton is difficult to produce. It requires a lot of water, a lot of transport. So cotton totes, even though that's a completely organic, natural substance, they're even worse for the environment. You have to use them thousands of times before they become greener than a plastic bag. So that's an issue with a lot of the green things that we see when we're choosing between something that's plastic and disposable versus something that we reuse. There's also some social justice issues there too. So we have reusable snack bags. They cost as much as a box of Ziplocs. So I'm fortunate enough to be in a position where I can buy a couple of these reusable Ziploc bags and I just wash them as we use them, but not everybody can. So reusable uses more energy and costs more upfront, but it's better for the planet in the long run if we're using it. So another example that I talk about in the book is with composting. And so we have curbside composting available to us here in Northern Colorado. And I was so excited when I found out, and I was like, all right, we're going to get signed up. And so my husband says, okay, can you tell me why we're paying extra every month to get rid of our compost when we could just put it in the trash? Doesn't it just degrade in the landfill? And the answer is it doesn't. So landfills this surprised me. This data surprised me because landfills are actually one of the biggest producers of greenhouse gases. And it's because, we put things in plastic bags and send them to the landfill and they block airflow. And so the only bacteria that's available to break down our organic waste produces more greenhouse gases than regular bacteria that usually break down our food. And so the food doesn't break down as efficiently and it releases more greenhouse gases. And so composting ends up being a better choice because then we have less material going to landfills, and landfills are a finite resource, and we have less greenhouse gases being emitted as well. So it's easy to think that, you can throw your banana peel in the trash and you don't ever have to worry about it again, but if it's not being composted, it's not actually being recycled.
Yeah, interesting. And I was trying to do some quick math in my head when you were saying that you need to use a cotton tote 1,000 times. I'm like, well, if you went grocery shopping once a week and there's 52 weeks a year, say you go 50 times, you have to use that cotton tote bag many, many years before you see the benefits of that over maybe using plastic. That's fascinating. It's not something I tend to think about.
Yeah, for sure. Or some people might say, well, I would get a plastic bag over those recycled polypropylene totes. Those are the ones that you see in the supermarkets. Mm-hmm. But then those are better than the cotton totes.
There you go. In reading your book, and being in this time when we're confronting COVID-19, a global pandemic, I found a lot of relevance in some of the topics you were covering and what you were saying, related to the transmission of diseases from animals to people, and, what it takes to get a drug to the market, and just thinking about that process and rigorous scientific study that's really required. So if you were writing the book today, would you address COVID-19, and what might have you included?
I would have definitely mentioned COVID-19 in the book because it's something that we're all experiencing. And others who've read the book kind of talk about how that's kind of the message of the book. There's all these little anecdotal stories of things that we run into and things that have been in the news. And so I try to make it as relevant as possible. So with COVID-19, I probably would have mentioned it in the conservation chapter. I guess I talk about the bushmeat crisis. So the bushmeat crisis is basically the hunting of wild animals that are also endangered in parts of the world that aren't quite as developed, so such as Africa. And so bushmeat is a traditional protein source for the people that live there, but with enhanced logging, then a lot of deforestation, it's really easy for people to get into the bush and harvest these animals. And there's an exotic animal trade, both for exotic medicine use and people who just want to eat exotic animals. And so part of the reason this is so damaging is because now we have access to areas of the world we haven't had access to before, and there's more human-wildlife contact. And so it's easy for things like COVID-19 to jump into humans for the first time. And then when we have global trade as well, it's easy for it to get spread around very quickly. And so one of the things I talk about in my book is if you're ever overseas and you have the opportunity to eat something exotic like a chimpanzee, maybe say no, because money talks. And if there aren't rich Western tourists going to these parts of the country, or parts of the world rather, and paying to eat these kinds of animals, then there isn't going to be the trade in it anymore.
So is there a question that you haven't been asked that you wish you would be?
So this is a question that I rarely get asked, but I think it's something that's in a lot of people's heads, is that they hear me talking about biology everywhere and they think it sounds really interesting. And then they stop and say, I don't know if I can do this. I don't think I can understand this. And occasionally someone will say, am I going to understand your book? And the answer is yes. Yes, you will. I believe in you, and I believe in your ability to engage with biology. So if you're listening to this and thinking, this sounds interesting, but I'm just not sure, give it a try, because what you find might surprise you.
So one last question for you. You mentioned the enculturation process of becoming a biologist in the book. What is the number one thing you love about that, or that process, or becoming a biologist? And what's the number one thing you would change?
That is an interesting question. I think with me, the most striking thing about the process of becoming a biologist and a scientist in general is how science really works. And I think that's why I focus on that quite a bit in the book, and also in my research as well, because it really surprised me how many dead ends there are, how creative it is, how much serendipity plays in. That's one story I mentioned in the book, that the paper that was a central part of my dissertation when I earned my PhD, it was a completely serendipitous observation. It was, could you please check this? And I looked and I saw it and I'm like, what? And I emailed my supervisor. I was like, did you expect to see this? And the answer was no. And it was so unusual that it led to an entire paper. And so I think it's realizing that science isn't really that boring, straightforward story we're taught in school. It's the creativity piece. It's seeing that overlap in my interest between science and our music. Yeah, so if we were to do something a little differently, I really wish that more people knew how creative science was and how exciting it can be, and that it's not just memorizing terms and boring facts that don't make sense, that it's very relatable to our lives. And it's really exciting.
Well, thank you. Thank you for coming on Authors and talking to us about biology everywhere. It does really make me think every day in my life about where I'm seeing those biological connections. So I appreciate you talking with us.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's been great.